All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Climate Adaptive Design Pre-Application webinar. We're going to get started with a short 5-minute video about the CAD Studio while more participants join the webinar.
Global warming leads to a more rapid change in our climate. We have areas that are dry becoming drier, areas that are wet becoming wetter. Intense precipitation has actually increased 71% in the Northeast. So in a lot of ways, New York is dealing with climate change on a much bigger scale than the national average and even the global average.
Our sea level is rising here in the city. There's no doubt about it. In Hurricane Sandy, we had a 6-7 foot surge here, and every inch that the water is higher is just one more inch that it's going to flood our neighborhood.
Residents and business owners want to know, how do I take care of the next high tide? How do I deal with the next flood?
Climate change is coming to every city, and we have an opportunity to make better choices that work for both now and for later.
In order for communities to become climate resilient, they must adapt. One strategy is to use inspirational, climate adaptive design.
What are you working on?
I'm doing our markups for the board. We have.
Oh, you're already doing that. That's great. My name is Josh Serra. I'm an assistant professor in landscape architecture, and this is our Cornell Climate Adaptive Design Studio.
The New York DEC has partnered with Cornell University's Landscape Architecture Department to create the Climate Adaptive Design Studio, or CAD. The Estuary program, our program, has annual grants that have a lot to do with flood resilience, green infrastructure, etc. I'm Libby Zamaitis. I'm a partner in the Climate Adaptive Design Studio, and I link in state resources and the communities into the program.
When you engage municipalities directly in a design studio, you really get teaching, research, and community benefits.
The CAD collaboration supports a program called Climate Smart Communities. It's a certification program similar to LEED for buildings, but it shows how dedicated to climate a community is and provides them funding and support.
We finished projects in the city of Hudson, Catskill, and now we're in the city of Kingston.
The design process begins with site visits to the community CAD is partnering with.
You can see where all this sediment is built up.
I work with the students to understand what climate change is. After that, we develop a set of working design concepts, some initial ideas, and then go and meet with people that are in the municipality we're working in. Right now, we'll have a half an hour for the students to introduce their design concept and then have a conversation.
We met with key stakeholders,
Landowners, business owners, residents, and municipal staff.
So you have to please multiple people while also still trying to be an ecologically responsible designer.
It's really not very pedestrian friendly currently. How did you guys propose to handle that?
You know, a lot of the communities we're working with, they're small, they're very limited in terms of staff and financial resources. So to have a group of students come in and offer really great design assistance, it's really a huge benefit to them.
Bright young kids, I mean, it doesn't get any better than that, right?
The students are going to take the feedback, incorporate those into their designs when they go back to the studio.
But we got a lot of feedback, and people didn't think what we had would work, and they know the city better than we do, so we've changed our design since then.
From there, we go on to move this towards a much more complete sense of what might be possible. Finally, we finish off with our final stakeholder open house.
Can you tell me about your concept here?
The students present their design alternatives to the community, but that's really where the community process truly begins.
We really hope to inspire communities to change.
And they get back to the original path, and it symbolizes kind of a commitment to change.
We hope that people will take these ideas and develop them further so that their cities can be what they would like them to become.
We talk a lot about building resilience in communities. These Cornell students are really helping illustrate that graphically.
Put a lot of time and effort and work into this.
This was a long studio, but it was fun.
The product that they've put together is something that will be able to be useful for us into the future. So I can't wait to see what goes on next.
To me, the most exciting part of CAD is the fact that we've flipped the conversation around climate change from a negative to a positive.
We're also envisioning that it's going to be something more playful so people can interact with the water on site. I think this is a great design. I think that solving some of these flooding problems will be really significant.
Getting people to see a vision for the future that brings in economic development, public safety, conserving natural resources. We're wrapping that all in with climate adaptation.
Seeing these visions, seeing these graphic designs, I am feeling inspired.
It's so wonderful to work in the Hudson River Valley. It has such sensitive natural beauty and such character and community, and how we can put that together in a future where climate change is in the mix is really what I think this project is all about.
Okay, welcome to the Climate Adaptive Design Studio 2021 Fall Studio Pre-Application Webinar. Thanks for joining us today. Gonna just point out a couple reminders before we get started and turn on closed captioning, which you can turn on or off. Okay, that video is available online, and we will be uploading a recording of this webinar. So we're recording this webinar, and that will be available as well as the slides later this week. We are going to go through the presentation and then take question and answers at the end. So feel free to type in any questions you have as we go into the Q&A box here on the bottom. You'll see on the bottom that you can click the little chat bubbles to do Q&A. There's a single chat bubble to write in the chat, which I'll be asking you all to do soon. You can also raise your hand if you would like to speak later in the Q&A session. And you can turn off the closed captioning. We are recording, as I mentioned, and I have one question for all of the participants before we get started. If you could just type into the comments field your name and title and which community you represent, if applicable. And then if you want to share one way that you really enjoy interacting with water, that's our little icebreaker for today. And as you type those into the chat, I will share that there are many ways I like to interact with water, but I live near the Wallkill River here in New Paltz, and I like to go down there with my kids. I grew up fishing on that river, at least trying to fish, but that's just one of many. And I'm Libby Zamaitis. I'm the Climate Change Program Coordinator at the Hudson River Estuary Program. We're part of the DEC and Cornell Water Resources Institute. I'm here in New Paltz, New York. I'm joined by Professor Josh Serra from the Cornell University Department of Landscape Architecture, our partner on the Climate Adaptive Design Studio, and then our other partner who you can't see is Liz LaJudas from Resilience Communications and Consulting LLC. I don't see anyone, no one's typed into the chat who they are or where they're from yet, but I see a lot of familiar names on there. Oh, here are some. So I'll just give you a minute to type that in if you're comfortable. At the very least, just put in if you're representing a certain community, because that helps us to know who's expressing interest in our program. All right, while you type that up, I'm going to bring back my screen. Okay, well, thank you for sharing, and continue to share who you are and where you're from as we go. And again, just a reminder, we'll have time for Q&A at the end. Okay, Getting into our presentation. Today, we're gonna give a little context to the CAD program and some of the work we do at the estuary program and the larger climate change context that we're dealing with. I'll briefly introduce the CAD studio and then hand it over to Professor Josh Serra to really dive into what the studio is all about and what the timeline and the process is like. And then finally, I'll help wrap up with next steps and a little more details on how to apply. And then we'll address all the question and answers at the end, and you can also raise your hand at the end to speak. So I'm really excited to be a partner on the Climate Adaptive Design Studio. I represent the Hudson River Estuary Program. We have been around for around 35 years. We're a non-regulatory part of the State Department of Environmental Conservation. And we try to work to protect this amazing region. We're a region of around 272 municipalities and 10 counties, depending on how you count it. The one quote to really drive home how important this region is to me is that we're 15% of the state's landmass, but we have around 85% of its biodiversity, of the state's biodiversity occurs here. So it's just a really rich environment, as many of you I'm sure are already aware. Mountains and rivers and a tidal estuary, a tidal Hudson, which is also why we're here today, is because we're tidal, we're dealing with flooding and sea level rise, and that's something that we're helping communities plan for. So I lead the climate change team for the program, and our long-term vision is that all of our communities are thriving, beautiful models for adapting to climate change. And we especially like to encourage natural and nature-based solutions, as well as equitable solutions, to try to preserve, the beauty of our area and the diversity of our area. So my team works along the adaptation project pipeline, as you could call it. So we work to try to inspire and educate communities and decision makers and raise the profile of adaptation and encourage adaptive thinking in the region. You just saw that video, which we'll add a link to that. Those short videos are one thing that we create. The next step is designing and planning, and that's kind of where CAD Studio comes in. We're really helping communities try to see, well, what could a vision for adaptation look like, and how do I achieve it? What are the plans, the designs necessary? And then finally, activating and scaling those visions. So we're not a large implementation funder, but we do have grants and funding and technical assistance to try to help your communities get to the point of achieving a larger state or federal grant to actually implement a project. And I'll get a little bit more into that with my next session, which is just a couple quick pieces of local climate adaptation news that I want to share. One is that our grants are currently open. They're called the Local Stewardship Planning Grants. We also have river access and river education grants. In total, there's about $750,000 available. They're open now, due in early June. They're $10,000 to $50,000 per project with only a 15% match, which can be in-kind services. Eligible projects include planning, studies, designs, or anything of the like for adapting to climate change, making water infrastructure more resilient, watershed and source water management, and then conservation of natural resources. So there's a link here, and there's a lot more information online. And if you'd like to talk to me about these, I'd be happy to follow up. The second piece is that we actually awarded in 2019 RFPs to 2 different design firms to partner with previous CAD communities. This was the first time we ever did it. We call it a phase 2 of the CAD studio, but the funding is $125,000 for each project, and it's to use a stakeholder engagement process to select design concepts that come from the CAD studio and develop them into actual projects. So 30% engineering design is one of the outcomes. So we just completed 2 of those projects. These images here are from a design for a reinforced public beach at Kingston Point. And we also worked on a living shoreline in Piermont. So we hope to offer that opportunity again later this year, and then again in the future to CAD communities. Okay, so now to the climate change context, just briefly run through a few reasons why we're here today working with Josh Serra. This New York State puts a lot of effort into modeling what our climate could look like in the future. We take the global climate models and we rerun them for New York State with all the local information. And we've determined that there's kind of three major hazards or trends in our climate that we're facing: increasing temperatures, changing precipitation, and rising sea level, which again affects 150 miles of the Hudson River up to the Troy Dam. And those lead to three climate risks or impacts to humans: heat waves, short-term drought, and flooding. So what we found is that we have 92 riverfront communities on the Hudson, the tidal Hudson, and a lot of the communities we've worked with are facing flooding from multiple angles. So it's really kind of a more complex issue. You might be dealing with riverine flooding and storm surge, sea level rise over time, storm water flooding coming off of your more urbanized and developed areas, and then freshwater flooding coming down from a tributary if you happen to be on a tributary. So this is kind of the context that CAD comes in to try to address some of these issues. I want to mention that New York State has officially adopted sea level rise projections out to the end of the century. This is a lot of numbers, but basically the point is that you can look what region you're in. If you're lower Hudson, which is south of Kingston, or mid Hudson, which is north, you could be looking up to 75 inches of additional sea level rise by the end of the century. And you are required to consider this in any state funding or permitting applications. So based on that, one of the first things we do in the Climate Adaptive Design Studio is try to really understand what flooding could look like in the future. So we did fund some LIDAR, which is this high resolution maps of the river to be able to project flooding and sea level rise on. You can find those and interact with those maps. There's a Columbia mapper and a Scenic Hudson mapper that I can share the links for. Here, just looking at one of our previous CAD communities, the village of Piermont, which is way down in Rockland County. They got hit really hard in Superstorm Sandy, as many of you did, over 20 million in damages to a very, very small community of just a few thousand people. So I'm going to just take you through their sea level rise and flooding maps. So this is the Hudson River shoreline in Piermont. If you haven't been there, it's called Pier. There's a big pier that goes out that has a big, beautiful marsh to the south. There's apartment buildings. The whole downtown is along the waterfront, restaurants, stores, marinas, etc. Like a lot of our communities, there's a lot going on the waterfront. So today, this is the mean sea level. You can see the blue is where the Hudson River is. Today is 1% flood zone, which is commonly called the 100-year flood zone. You can see is a large part of that waterfront. That's the light yellow color. I just want to mention that, the 1% flood has a chance of happening 1% every year based on historical averages, which means that that's actually more of a 25% chance of happening over 30 years. So it's a much more common flood than a lot of people think about. Plus, it doesn't include future sea level rise or changing precipitation patterns. So if we start projecting sea level rise on top of that, if you add another foot of sea level rise, so a foot higher that the Hudson will be, you start to see that the yellow-brown color becomes darker, which means that there'll actually be a deeper flood during that 1% flood. And then you might not be able to see it yet, but you'll start to see little blue spots, especially as we go out to 2050s or 30 inches of sea level rise. You see all of this blue in the marsh and around the edges. Those are areas that are projected to be inundated either all the time or during high tide. So if we keep going out to years 2080s, 54 inches of sea level rise, you see a lot of blue and darker blue, so darker inundation. The flood zone's also growing, but that's not as obvious because there's a steeper slope here. And then finally, 2100 with a potential of 72 inches of sea level rise, you see that the river has taken back a lot of the coastline, the marshland, the waterfront. There's almost an islanding effect of the pier. So this is the context that we're talking about, is how do you prepare for this and how do you think about your future waterfront and make sure that you have all of the same access and resources in the future that you do enjoy today. So that's the depressing part. And then the positive part is that, adaptation is very much in our hands, that we are empowered to adapt to this changing climate and sea level rise on a smaller scale. not everyone, has full power over this, but we do have a lot of ability to change the way we build, move where we build, do things a little more smarter, use nature. And this can be done on a community level, a business level, or a landowner level. And then we talk about resilience, which is the ability to thrive under the change and to be able to bounce forward to a better normal, to a better future. So speaking of resilience, nature we really consider to be the true expression of resilience, because plants have evolved to come back stronger, build their roots deeper when they get hit by a hurricane or something like that. So while these harder shorelines and harder structures, they provide us protection maybe today, they can crumble and fall and fail and lead to disastrous outcomes and be extremely costly over the long term. Whereas if we're able to design more with nature, we can save money and have all of these amazing co-benefits like cleaner water and air, carbon sequestration, habitat, and a lot of other wonderful things. So that brings me to the Climate Adaptive Design Studio, which is working with landscape architect designers from Cornell University. Their specialty is, natural and nature-based solutions, although they also can get into some more hard structural solutions as well. That's what they know, that's what they do. That's why I love, this program. And really the ultimate outcome is these beautiful inspirational designs for what your future could look like. And you'll see that these designs can really vary. So, you might like some, you might not like others, but it's about starting that community conversation. So it's a collaboration between Professor Josh Serra and the DEC. We've been to 5 different communities: Hudson, Catskill, Kingston, Piermont, and Ossining. Again, we are investing in this phase 2, which is really going on to see what's actually possible from the concepts that come from the CAD studio. We also work with a bunch of local and state partners that like this program and support it. So that helps your community kind of start conversations with other partners as well, or maybe even some agencies. So now I'm going to hand it over to Josh Serra, the professor, to go a little bit more into what the studio is all about. Thank you.
Okay. I would just like to say welcome everybody and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. I really appreciate it. It's been a real treasure to work with folks at DEC and communities in the Hudson River Estuary over the last years. And so looking forward to more. Next slide, please. And I guess there's a couple things I'd like to say. There's a number of issues we confront when we work in the studio. And the first is climate change. Climate change is real. It's coming to every city. And it's something that all of us have begun to think about working with. The second thing, next slide, really 3 problems. The second thing is that climate change is changing how and where cities can exist. And so we need to find ways to work with these issues. And so one of the ways that we think about it is, how can we take a look at some of the negative concerns that are around it and find ways to become more inspired. And so actually in the background here, you can see some of our students working on some design concepts as they imagine sort of balancing cut and fill on the waterfront. The third problem, and this is where really where this idea about being inspired to change really comes through. Climate change is depressing and it's confusing, and in many ways it really kind of exists in the atmosphere in the minds of people. It's something that really is not tangible and easy to understand as an issue, but also what can be done about it. And so we're trying to find ways. We look for ways to really take a negative kind of conversation and really turn it into a positive opportunity moving forward. And we think that we can access design to do that. Next slide. And so this is really where the birth of the Climate Adaptive Design Studio came. This notion that we can work with both people and place, understand the physical issues at hand, but also appreciate and value all the things that people can be doing and the ways that those two things interact. Next slide, please. And so really we can take a look at those two things when we think about our place and the people within it. If we can actually enhance community capacity through discussing about these issues, working ideas, exchanging different resources that we can bring to the table at the community level, that enhances our adaptive capacity as a community. And in doing that, that improves the likelihood and the opportunity to increase our capacity physically and ecologically when we think about resilience and our futures along waterfronts in the Hudson and beyond. And so those two things help feed upon one another. And so when I think about the design work we do, I really think about those two things at once as a way where we can really operate with all the levers and make change both important and inspirational for the communities we work with. Next. And so most of that work happens in the Hudson River estuary. And as many of you who are along the Hudson River waterfront know, this estuary is amazing. It's one of the most unique places. Some of the Native American tribes, there are many names for the Hudson River estuary over the years, but one of the names that a Native American tribe that lived in the estuary was Mohawkentuck. And loosely translated, that means the river that flows both ways. Those of you that live on the Hudson River or are familiar with the Hudson know that it is tidally influenced because it's connected to the ocean, and because that elevation, that grade change is so gentle because it's such a massive basin, that there are daily tidal fluctuations 150 miles all the way up the river up to the federal dam at Troy. And so what that means is you have river flows heading down south to the ocean. You also have tidal flows moving upstream, as well as some of the other impacts and issues that we work with when we talk about climate change, but even generally the ocean effects of tidal surge and flooding that can come with that. The other thing I want to say about the Hudson River estuary is it's incredibly biodiverse. It has some of the most rare habitats globally, and that are globally recognized as unusual because of that tidal condition. There are so many wetland types in this area, and to have freshwater tidal wetlands in some conditions, but also some of the marine and estuarine or brackish water wetlands in this area make it for an incredibly biodiverse fishery and place for stopover for many kinds of fish and wildlife. Next. It also happens to be an incredible place for people and communities. The over 85 cities that are situated up the Hudson River estuary really have a sense of connection to the river, a sense of history, and a sense for what it means for them in the bioregion to have such an amazing and beautiful place nearby. And so actually we've circled the different cities we've worked in that Libby mentioned. And if you look at the bottom right, that's actually one of our community meetings that we held when we were with one of the communities. I believe it was in Pyrmont. Next slide. And so the composition of the climate adaptive program really counts on three things. First and foremost, next. It is the community. We're trying to find ways as much as possible to involve every member of communities that when we work with them in the Climate Adaptive Design Studio. We have our city staff, neighbors, businesses, NGOs that we're involved with. Next. Of course, we pair with our key partner, the Hudson River Estuary Program at DEC. Which they bring to the table incredible policy and permitting knowledge, as well as ecologists and climate outreach expertise, as well as a long history of engaging with these communities. And finally, it's us in the studio. Next. And that includes, importantly, the students and as well as some of the faculty and some of my research team. I think now would be a good time to actually talk for a minute about the studio itself in terms of the structure. I don't know how many of you have had a past design career. So I want to talk for a moment about what the studio is. The studio actually, probably the easiest way to talk about it is that we are a practice. Landscape architecture is a practice, much like law or medicine or engineering. It provides a path to licensure. And so students learn about a lot of technical things in their courses, site grading and drainage, plant selection, principles of urban design. So also theory, design theory. And those we learn about in courses, but because it's a practice, it needs to be practiced. And so the genesis of that begins in the design studio. Students can take some of the knowledge that they generate, through those other courses and bring them to a project that's conducted in the studio to develop those skill sets and find ways to put things together that make the most sense or paint a vision for a community that they see as the most valuable. And so that studio is really where we meet these three elements, the DEC, the community that we work with, and the students themselves. And so each one of those elements depends upon another for the success of a program like the Climate Adaptive Design Program. Next. And so we're looking for ways to work with different municipalities because we really feel that linkage really creates new ideas, new opportunities. There may be some things that you will learn from us, but we're also going to learn, and I hope we learn even more from you. That's never failed us in terms of the potential of the kinds of interactions we have. We know some things about some of the data and the information and some of the climate topics, but you are most positioned to help us understand what your waterfront is, what your vision for it is, and what possibilities there may be moving forward. And so we try to provide those linkages to envision the more resilient and connected waterfront areas. We're also looking for ways to balance a number of different things, that can mean economic growth and some of the ecologicals and conditions that are out on the site, as well as some of the best available climate science that's available to inspire cities to thrive by acting now on climate. The choices we make now are one we're going to work with into the future. And if we understand that the climate projections and want to work with them, the sooner we can be having these conversations, the better. And on that last bullet point, we do create these design products, these designs that come out, these alternative design strategies that come out of this program. But in many ways, the product is valuable too, the process is valuable too. The ways we can encourage stakeholder interaction and community capacity building by having these dialogues, these discussions about these issues is really what we hope inspires long-term action and benefits. So it's a combination of both process and product. Next slide. And so there are quite a few benefits for our partner communities. I'll mention some of the benefits, additionally beyond this slide. But there really are those new conversations about opportunity and change that happen on a waterfront through the structure we develop in the studio and how we engage with a community. You could anticipate that your community members have more knowledge about climate change and the options for climate adaptation that are there. And also by working with our DEC partners, we have ideas for how to access funding to move some of the adaptive ideas forward that you may find through the studio or carry even further. And then also an increased awareness and capacity to apply these concepts and principles as you move beyond the studio itself. The studio has an inherent value, we hope, but the principles that come from it and the appreciation for the concepts really helps new planning processes incorporate those elements moving forward. And then finally, on the product side, you do have these alternative design strategies that can be used. They're graphic, they're visual, they are useful at communicating different ideas that could happen on a waterfront, and they can be used and accessed to enhance public awareness and support for adaptation and resilience moving forward. Next slide. And so I outlined some of the community benefits. I've sort of summarized them on the upper right, but we also have education benefits for our students as well. They learn about engaging with you as stakeholders, and they also develop skills in climate adaptation. And at the same time, I'm kind of working in the background to understand how different techniques can be applied across waterfronts, as well as the act of working with you really helps me understand how we can be most effective. And so this combination of education, community, and research benefits is really where the sweet spot where the Climate Adaptive Design Studio exists. Next. And so I just want to talk for a second about our process. There's much more that's going on in the background, but there's 3 key meetings that you can anticipate that will happen in a studio setting, and a meeting on the beginning side of prior to the studio, and at least 1 meeting after the studio to sort of build up, and then also look for ways moving forward. And so in mid-August, the municipality that we work with will actually have a kickoff and an intro call with you to discuss what's going to happen in the studio and how we can develop ideas, go through some of the logistics, sure, but start talking about some of the key things that can fall in place. And then we have our first community meeting in mid-September. It's a visioning discussion, but it's also a discussion of risks. One of the first things we talk about, there's really 2 questions that I posed at the beginning of this. The first one is, what are your concerns for climate change? And the second thing is, what is your vision for your waterfront? What would you like to do moving forward? Because all of those things need to fold up into a future as cities imagine what their waterfront can be. We'll take that information, go back to the design studio, just like you saw in the video at the beginning, and work in the background to understand how we might develop different design concepts based on the issues at hand. We've learned a tremendous amount from the community that we work with, and we want to find ways to apply some of that knowledge. We'll take our initial concept plans back in mid-October and have what I like to call a stakeholder workshop, where there's an opportunity for exchange in smaller groups to talk about some of the proposed design concepts, what's working, what was missed, things that are co-developed to say, how we might approach a question or a concern in a new light, and have really a set of, we hope, useful conversations that can help us move our design ideas forward. After that mid-October meeting, we'll go back in the studio, and in a studio environment, often there will be expert reviewers that will, whether they're faculty or practitioners, that take a look at the different work, the different types of work that the students have developed, provide feedback and ways for them to refine and hone that work. And occasionally we can have some of our stakeholder members also join us there, which is really a wonderful opportunity, and sort of a look inside the studio, if you will, at how things can work. And then finally, after the designs are final, we have what's called a final open house in mid-December, which we open up to community members as you see fit, to talk about our ideas, share those final works that we devised over the month or so that we have after our last meeting. I guess it's a month and a half, something like that. And then that work is yours. There's paper boards that you can see that we've sort of have mounted here, but also there's PDF products as well that are available after that open house. And then after some of the holidays are over and the new year has begun, we'll have a debrief meeting with key stakeholders to kind of plan next steps, to talk about what worked, things that you see moving forward, and what it would take to get to the next stage of your climate adaptive thinking in your community. Last thing I want to say is we've really learned, all of us, to react to different and changing scenarios over the last year and a half. And so one thing that we feel comfortable with and prepared for is the ability to meet you and to be able to do one of 3 things, shall we say, as we embark on this process with you. Either to be able to meet in person, depending on how situations go in the coming future, The ability to be all remote is something we've also premeditated, and also the possibility of maybe a combination of in-person and remote engagement through a number of ways that we can find to interact and also be successful in our goals in the climate adaptive design program. And so how this will unfold exactly is to be determined, but we feel pretty confident we can deliver the kinds of things that are important to our communities that we work with as we move into the fall. Next slide. And so really it is about those two things. This idea of interacting and engaging, sharing and exchange of ideas that builds that adaptive capacity and that network that will come together through some of the steps in the process, and discussions about that physical and ecological capacity building when we talk about resilience and adaptation that this is about. Next slide. And so I just want to spend a minute on a couple key principles. There's no rocket science here, but a few things have sort of come about over the past years in terms of how we see the potential for a program like this and the kinds of ideas that we promote in the climate adaptive design program when we think about our waterfronts. And the first one, again, no rocket science here, but is if you're going to design a waterfront, you should design a waterfront. You should maximize the value of what your waterfront can be. That means thinking about water enhanced and water dependent assets that can be on the waterfront and focusing most on those, taking advantage of this waterfront space to make it a key contributor to your future, but also your present day as you look at some of your planning goals moving forward. Next. The second principle is about designing for flooding. This idea about working with water and how it may be better to work with it than against it. We do hear about the three options: reinforcement, adaptation, and strategic relocation. Sure, we need to make choices about all those assets that are on our waterfront, and it may make sense to accept some of the risks and costs associated with reinforcement under certain conditions. We also can be aware of adaptation options that are out there, ways we can grade the site, ways we can work with our structures to allow water in or anticipate that water may be coming in, but also for how to get it off site and how we can get back up into our operation as quickly as possible. And then finally, thinking about places where we may want to strategically adapt. The third one, principle next, is designing. I wrote on here design for community, but this is actually an older slide. We actually could call it designing with community, because that is what we do, is we design with community. It's this idea that we need to be thinking about the people that are on the waterfront, that use the waterfront today, and that could be using it tomorrow, first and foremost, when we think about the kinds of experiences that people have on the waterfront. And so every community is different in terms of what those goals and those principles are. But what we found over the years is that there are a couple things that are consistent. The first thing is that the waterfront should be universally accessible. They should be accessible both to those that are citizens of the municipality and also for visitors, and inviting as well. And also they should be decidedly memorable. This waterfront is an important part of each one of your communities, and we need to find ways to optimize that and make it the best possible asset for your municipality, both for today and for tomorrow. Next slide. The fourth principle is design with nature. This idea that a healthy Hudson is good for us and for the greater ecology. Libby alluded to some of this topic earlier, but it's this idea that we know that this is an incredible ecological asset that these municipalities live on, and we want to find ways to enhance that. But we also want to realize that there are a lot of things that those ecosystems do for us. How can we optimize the quality of the environment to provide the services that we count and depend on when we look ahead towards our future with respect to climate and lots of other ways that we use the water. And then the final principle, next slide, is designing for change. This idea that this waterfront needs to be an incredible asset both today, but also into the future. Yes, there will be transitions, but it needs to be a working part of a city, of a municipality, both today, 2020s and 2050s and 2080s out into the future. And so how do you do that? That's an important question as we imagine that transition. The other thing we talk about and we seek to do is to realize that although there are examples of design concepts in mega cities, ones that could possibly be rapidly implemented with massive budgets and millions of people, that's not the case on the Hudson. In the 85 plus cities here, we need to find ways to phase in these strategies. And so that's another thing that we do to talk about what wins can we have early on and how do we build some of this work in over time. And so phasing is an important part of this project as well as we look at in opportunities moving forward. Next slide. And so it really is about building a culture of adaptation, both in your municipality and beyond. And there's one more slide here, I think. You can see examples of people working with us. And so this idea about working in the Climate Adaptive Design Studio, it's work we're doing, but we also want to work with you. And so I think this is my last slide. I left a website there, https://trophic.design/CAD. You can see some of our prior work. And I look forward to the Q&A at the end of this talk. But until then, Libby, I think it's your next.
All right, thank you, Josh. I'm just going to remind everyone that we're going to have a Q&A at the end, so feel free to type questions into the Q&A box, but you can also raise your hand at the end and I can unmute you. I've just got a few more slides about being a CAD community partner and then just touching up on what it means to apply to our CAD studio. So setting some expectations, I think Josh did a great job of explaining, that we're very interactive with the community and we want to get stakeholders engaged, and there's multiple points to give feedback on design concepts. So really, probably the most important thing is the process, but you also get some, nice products out of it as well. So you get an introductory guide to CAD that kind of outlines the whole thing and some of the strategies we use to get started. And then you get a lookbook of design strategies and ideas of how to implement concepts with everything from funding to regulatory considerations to how they might line up with different climate smart communities, actions, et cetera. So this image here is an example of the cover of Osening's lookbook. And this is really, I think, what we hope municipal staff will use and volunteers moving forward after the studio. And then, of course, you get, as Josh mentioned, the beautiful student design boards, which are large, printed and digital design concepts. So setting some expectations, we're here to really start a conversation or can help continue a conversation on what change could look like on your waterfront. We want you to leave the studio feeling more inspired and knowledgeable about how you could adapt to climate change. And we hope that you carry on the concepts and principles ahead, in any future planning and projects. We also hope to introduce you to some funding and resources and contacts that might be useful, and have the opportunity to open the doors with talking to regulatory staff, because obviously any type of work done on a waterfront may be highly regulated. And then finally, just increase public awareness and support for this type of work. Just to be clear about what we're not hired hands to provide detailed site level design that is ready to be implemented. That would be phase 2 or beyond. We're not here to make any decisions about your community's future. We're not here to solve any community issues or to be prescriptive with our solutions, or to work for specific landowners or in specific interests. We're here to just, help foster that community conversation and think about what could be possible over the next century. Some ideas of what you can do right after the CAD studio ends is we highly encourage you to put the CAD designs on display to the public. We've seen some communities, have events and incorporate them. We've seen them put into storefront windows. There's lots of different ways to do it. Have them in the library and public spaces. Again, as we mentioned, we want to see you, continue to use these concepts in existing or future projects and plans. So if you're, writing a new RFP or updating a plan, it might be relevant to reference the CAD studio and the designs. And then we want to see you apply for funding to continue to develop these concepts into implementable designs, whether that's our funding or our partners at Department of State and elsewhere. Just a couple examples of what some previous CAD communities are up to now. This is really just, all of these communities are doing many, many wonderful things. And I just wanted to highlight a couple that are related to the type of work we do in CAD. Kingston is right now creating an entirely new climate action plan. They already created one in 2015, but this one is going to have resilience and adaptation throughout. So it's going to be combined with climate mitigation. They also, a couple of years ago, referenced CAD in an RFP for shoreline upgrades to the Rondout. So we were happy to see that. The city of Hudson referenced CAD in their downtown revitalization initiative grant. And there's a few other things going on in Hudson right now. They recently completed a natural resource inventory. We hope to work with them more in the future. Piermont is looking to update their zoning to consider flooding and sea level rise, and also write, I believe, what will be their first comprehensive plan with resilience throughout. And then finally, Ossining is considering CAD throughout their comprehensive planning process, which is happening right now. All right, last part of the presentation is how to apply. So first of all, I'm glad you're on this webinar, and we'll be providing a recording for anyone who couldn't make it. The letter of interest is supposed to be very simple. It's not supposed to be a big application or anything. It can be a 1-page, maybe 2-page thing. It's due 5 p.m. on Monday, May 10th, so you still have almost a month. You can email that to me, and all the information is online. There is no direct cost to be a CAD community. All we ask for is your time and some help organizing some events. So a few things we do require is reliable contact info and your help outreaching to community stakeholders and stakeholders across sectors and scales. So we want public, private, businesses, nonprofit, any type of potential stakeholders, residents, local, maybe regional, county. So we really try to think through who has a stake in this waterfront, who needs to be at the table. We need key municipal staff and landowners to be involved at those key points: the introductory call, the initial site visit and stakeholder review, the final presentation and debrief session. And then we do require that you host one public event with the CAD posters, whether that's putting them in an existing event that's planned, having an event, or you can be creative in how you want to do that. We've seen several different options for that. We've found that successful communities applying to CAD have one or more, or hopefully all of the following. One is in commitment to inclusive stakeholder engagement. That is required. We are understanding more and more what it means to try to truly be inclusive. And that's how you design your meetings, where they are, when they are, which we know might be a little different with COVID, but we can provide some resources on what we've learned, and we would like to work, our best to make them as inclusive as possible. You might have concerns about changing risks, challenges, and opportunities on your waterfront, maybe all of them, maybe new development pressure that's happening that you might be concerned about, flooding and sea level rise and safety. Interest in developing a resilient waterfront vision that again could be included in these other plans and projects moving forward. A lot of our communities have local waterfront revitalization plans that they incorporate these concepts into, or they write new ones, new LWRPs, and that actually has quite a bit of funding behind it. We've also worked with the Brownfield Opportunity Area program, so things like that. Interest in waterfront access and waterfront access for all. So public spaces, boating, fishing, festivals, anything that could go that is safe. And then finally, social, economic, and or infrastructure vulnerabilities on your waterfront, which you are likely already aware of, maybe specific concerns, perhaps, a wastewater treatment plant in your flood zone or something like that. So the application is just a letter of interest signed by the municipal governing board answering 5 basic questions, which I'll go over next. You would need any additional, if there are major waterfront landowners besides the municipality in the area that you would like to study, you will need letters of support from them that show that they would be involved in the process and they understand that this is addressing New York State projections for sea level rise and flooding and thinking about the future. It's optional, but you can also incorporate letters of support from other community partners, community-based organizations, or the like. So finally, the basic questions are obviously name and contact info of the municipality, and then just some detailed information on any kind of current challenge or opportunity or planning process or anything that's going on right now that we could help plug into. Answering number 3, why do you want to participate in the CAD studio? How will it help you in the future? We specifically ask you for 3 or more people representing municipal boards or committees that will actively be our partners throughout the entire studio. And then a contact person. So we tried to make it easy. Hopefully it is. I'm just going to wrap up now, and then we're going to turn this off so we can start looking at all the Q&As. So this is, this is how I think about CAD is, when we go into the new community, I try to look up old photos or paintings of that community from like 100 or 150 years ago. So this is Piermont, probably, well over 100 years ago. And it just inspires me to think, how much can change in a relatively short amount of time. So that's really what we're here for, is to help your community see what different futures could look like and then react to it. So you might see this and say, no, that's not for me. Or you might see it and say, that's what I want to work toward. So that's what it's all about, is trying to understand what those options are. And then we're your partners before, after, and during the studio to try to help you realize that and try to help you connect you to state resources and funding and planning and things like that. So thank you for listening to this presentation. Sign up for our newsletter. It only goes out every couple months and it focuses on funding and new information and events. And you can visit us online. I'll put a few of the key links that we talked about in the chat now. But yeah, I'm gonna turn this off. And we'll transition. I'm going to read out the Q&A, and then Josh and I will field the questions, and then people can also raise their hand to speak. Okay. So it looks like Neil Curry would like to ask a question, maybe speak, because it's a more complex question. So I'm going to allow Neil Curry to speak.
Hello, thanks.
Hi, Neil. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, thanks very much. First of all, this is really helpful. I'm a little bit overwhelmed though, because there's a few things that could be happening this fall that may kind of overlap with this. So first, it was good to hear that you've worked in other communities with LWRP, as Town of Lloyd does have that. There's been there were 4 sort of major projects that were proposed, and the town's done 2 of them, and I think made progress on another. So it'd be important for, I think, the students to be familiar with that. And we are going to be going through the Climate Smart Resiliency Planning Tool program later this year. So I'm wondering how this could potentially overlap with that, or maybe we'll just have kind of saturation with the participation we need from community leaders to do this and that as well. And we may also have some students, I guess this is the climate change engagement and education plan. They may be working with some Cornell students on that as well. So I'm just wondering if maybe we might be biting more off than we can chew as far as all this stuff goes. I think it's all really exciting and all really useful. I just don't know where. I guess we're the ones who have to answer what's sort of most important to us. But I guess I'm curious to get your thoughts on how these things overlap.
Sure, that's a great question, and I'm glad that Lloyd's doing so many things. So,
well, we're not doing it yet, but.
All right. Well, either way, I mean, everything you mentioned, I totally get, the wanting to avoid burnout and stakeholder burnout or confusion. The things you mentioned, I believe, could play well with CAD. It all kind of comes down to specific timing, but if you think that the timing could be an opportunity for us to improve or help or assist or, better any of those projects or work off of them, then I think it would be a great time. But if you think that they wouldn't necessarily interact at all, then you could always wait and apply next year. And answering another question, we select one community. Last year, or 2 years ago now, we did select the town and village of Ossining. So if there's like a shared waterfront, that's fine. It could potentially be 2 municipalities, but it's one stretch of waterfront, typically one community. We hope to offer this, and we plan to offer this Engage Studio every year, once a year. So hopefully there'll be an opportunity next year if you don't feel like this year is the right time. But yeah, I can, Josh, do you want to speak more to Neil's question, or do you want me to say a bit more?
Yeah, this was the, I don't have anything more specifically to add for Neil's question at this time. If you look at your work and what you're doing, probably I think positioning that in your letter and in your letter of interest, I think would be really helpful, so we can understand how we can be the most useful for you as you consider your process and a number of kind of developing things going on.
Yeah, and it might be, if you said the projects haven't started. I mean, sometimes CAD is a good way to get the conversation going, get people engaged, and then feed them into another project. So it could be that it is a good time if other things are delayed.
Okay, thanks.
And I'm happy to talk more after this. We have Michelle Gluck asked what the approximate capacity and time commitment of municipal staff or committees for CAD, and can you speak to how this may have changed through the pandemic with virtual meetings, et cetera? So that's a good question. So the commitment for municipal staff is there's really 5 total events, you could say. There's the kickoff call or meeting. There's the 2 site visits, which include, the second one has some stakeholder reviews, and then there's the final open house, and then there's a debrief after everything's done. So that's 5 different meetings or events, really 2 or more events. So it's the planning, preparation, and attendance of all of those events. So I think it could vary depending on the municipality. But I mean, if I had to throw a number out, I would say, at least 5 hours for each event on average. So maybe 25 hours. That's, again, for someone that could be 20, for another it could be 50. But it needs to, at least at minimum, those events need to be committed to and well attended and help with outreach and things like that. As far as virtual meetings and the pandemic, it's still somewhat of a question mark, but we have developed some different tools to do things in virtually or hybrid. We also in the fall tend to have nicer weather, so outdoor meetings or site visits are always outdoor, is more possible. We can't commit one way or the other right now to what it will be, if it will be all in person, all virtual, or hybrid, because it depends on a lot of factors. But we're committed to making it the best experience possible. And in our experience, at least, it doesn't necessarily take more time to do it one way or the other. It's just a different way of approaching it. So, like a virtual event, you might be able to invite way more people and get way more input, but it won't have that same, in-person feel. Josh, do you want to speak to any of that?
No, I think that's a good summary. And we've been working with challenges, all of us, over the last year or more now, year and a half. And at the same time, we have those challenges in front of us. We also have other challenges, the challenges with climate also ahead. And so finding a way to put those things together is important for our program, and we hope it is for you. And that's really what we want to do, is meet you to understand how we can best do this and be the most effective for you. We'll work with those challenges, but we want to make this the most successful process moving forward with the community that we work with.
Okay, we have another question about, do we need those 3 key staff volunteers or elected officials to attend those 5 meetings along with other stakeholders? Yeah, so it's a little different. The first meeting is like a kickoff planning meeting. So it would just be for those 3 key staff members and our internal planning team, Josh and myself and Liz. And that's kind of, to strategize everything, start to think about stakeholders. And then those 3 middle meetings, those are the ones that are really more community meetings. So the first is the site visit, where the students are hopefully looking at the site in person for the first time. So we do have a meeting with kind of key stakeholders for like the waterfront, to be able to really just give basic information and answer questions about the waterfront. Then that second meeting is the actual stakeholder review, where students have design concepts for people to gather around and look at and provide feedback and answer questions. So that's where we want, a good cross section of the community. It can't be too big because it's this review format. I think we usually have between 20 and 30 people total. And then the third event is the one that's typically the public event, where it's showing off the final designs. It's usually an open house with some food. And that's the one where we often see communities, inviting the whole community or a larger audience. And then finally, the fifth meeting is a debrief. So typically a smaller group to talk about, what did you like? What didn't you like? What designs do you want to carry forward? What are some strategies to do so? So that's all laid out in more detail in the introductory guide. So I guess I can probably provide that information to everyone as a follow-up. Okay, anybody want to, we have someone raising their hand. Sorry if it took me a while to catch. Oh. Neil, did you want to say anything else? That was you.
Yeah, I just wanted to, with those meetings, I assume the venues for those will be in the community that you work with. Okay.
Yeah, that's, we find that if we've had the meetings, at beautiful locations on the river, we've had it at city halls. We find it's very successful when we're doing like a bigger stakeholder review or the final meeting, to be in the community as much as possible and meet people where they are. So we can also, we've had meetings like in community centers or in, churches, things like that, places where it's kind of, that would all be determined in that introductory strategy meeting, is to figure out, who do we need to reach? How do we reach them? How do we go to where people are? So it's flexible, but it's in the community, as long as it can be, unless it has to be totally virtual, which hopefully it doesn't. But
and
if I had to guess, I'd say we're looking at a hybrid, virtual in person, but we have to see.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. So would the core group of key staff officials or any stakeholders, would we be needing to travel up to Cornell for the kickoff meeting potentially?
The kickoff meeting can be on Zoom or on the phone, or potentially we can meet, in your community outside or something like that. It's always nice to meet in person. It's not at Cornell, it's in the Hudson Valley. The one time that people can go to Cornell, it's totally optional, is you can go review the actual studio in Cornell. I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful campus, beautiful building. You can see Josh in action with all the students, and you can give feedback in the formal setting. I usually do it every semester, and it's a really good time, and it's just another opportunity to give input. So you can invite other relevant municipal staff or community members to do that as well.
Yeah, and I would just emphasize or just say that that's a voluntary thing. If it works for you, it works for us too, so we can find a way to do that.
Okay. And just one, sorry to be getting into the weeds, but the just so I know, so I can try to sell this to people here. Any costs, like you mentioned, having food at like the open house, like does the program cover those costs, or does the town need to supply that kind of stuff?
Go ahead, Josh, I think.
I would say those are the things that we cover. We try to find ways to support the meetings, and a great way for people to attend, if we can be in person, is to have food available. Sometimes these are during the lunch hour, sometimes they're in the afternoon, an opportunity for coffee and a snack. But those are things that we're looking for to provide.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I keep assuming all this in-person stuff is going to be doable in the fall, and hopefully that's the case, but I guess we shouldn't assume.
I hope so. Like Josh said, the food's a key motivator.
Yeah. And we have done outdoor meetings like last summer when cases were really down, and we felt pretty safe. We did an in-person meeting at the pavilion at Highland Landing Park. So the weather
That's
holds
great.
out, we could maybe do that.
That's my hope, is some type of at least hybrid option like that, and to take advantage of the good weather. So all right, we have another question. Is the 250,000 of follow-up implementation funding that you mentioned only open to municipalities that have previously been in the CAD studio? Yes, that is true. So that really is supposed to be a huge motivator, is that we offer these $125,000 each RFP to take the concepts from the studio and to have a process with professional designers and your community to develop it into an implementable project and to get to 30% engineering design. So we did 2 of them in Piermont and Kingston. Only CAD communities are eligible. So it's a great reason to do CAD. We hope to offer these RFPs every year or every 2 years. The RFP actually is applied for by a consulting firm. It's like a design firm and an engineering firm with the community as a partner. And we did that on purpose because we know how much community capacity is an issue. So this way the consultant has to apply for it, has to do all of the reporting and all the technical details of the grant. But the product is for you, it's for your community. You have to be, a key partner throughout the whole thing, obviously. But the consultant actually handles that. So we have a web, I can put the link to a recording of the webinar that discussed the previous 2 projects from the consultants themselves. And it shows, the process and the design outcomes and everything. But we're hoping that leads CAD communities ultimately to, phase 3, which would be the final phase of implementing a project. And we have identified, certain state funders that have the implementation funds to do that. So I'll put a link to that now. All right, any other questions? I'll give everyone 1 more minute while I find this link.
I wonder if Neil had another question, or his hands raised. It may have been from before. Okay.
here's the webinar we did on the phase 2 funding that we did in Kingston and Piermont. And we're soon going to have a web page on that as well. Okay. All right, well, just to recap then, while feel free to ask another question or raise your hand, but to recap, we just want to remind you that the letter of interest, which is hopefully pretty straightforward, 1 or 2 pages, or however much you feel inspired to write, is due May 10th. We will be getting in touch with any applicants in June, and everyone will hear by July. The studio is for this upcoming fall, August through December. And I will be following up later this week with all of you with the recording of this webinar, the slides, and any other key information. So yeah, please, if you know any other municipalities that might be a good fit, or if you just want to, keep in touch, please keep in touch. And thanks for your time today. All right, great. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining.
Bye-bye.
Bye.